The first thing I noticed was the heaviness in my limbs, like they were weighed down by lead. My eyelids fluttered open, and the sterile, dimly lit hospital room came into focus. The soft hum of medical equipment surrounded me, interrupted only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so disoriented. Then it hit me. Surgery. I shifted slightly, feeling the tug of the IV in my arm and the dull ache that radiated from my abdomen. The surgery had been necessary, they said, but now that it was over, I was left alone in this cold room with only the machines for company. My eyes searched the room, half hoping to see my boyfriend sitting in the corner, but the chair was empty. He had been here earlier, holding my hand until the anesthesia pulled me under. But now, he was gone, having left when visiting hours ended. I tried to remember his last words to me, something reassuring, but the fog in my mind made it hard to hold on to anything concrete. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. It felt like the walls were closing in, the dim light from the single window casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the courtyard was dark, the faint outline of trees barely visible in the gloom. Every so often, a distant footstep echoed down the hallway, but otherwise it was eerily quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Maybe it was just the after effects of the medication, the anesthesia still clinging to my senses, making everything feel off. Or maybe it was the emptiness of the room, the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I shifted in the bed, wincing at the soreness, and pulled the thin blanket up higher around my shoulders. My hand brushed against the call button, and for a brief second, I considered pressing it, just to hear a voice, any voice. But I hesitated, not wanting to be the patient who cried wolf. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to will myself to sleep, telling myself that the unease was all in my head. But even with my eyes shut, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I focused on the steady beeping of the heart monitor, using it like a metronome to calm my racing thoughts. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I could almost feel the room around me, the cold air brushing against my skin, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. I told myself it was just the hospital, just the medications, and that everything would be fine in the morning. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The hospital room was still, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every breath, every rustle of the sheets. The only light came from the hallway, a soft glow that seeped under the door, casting long shadows on the walls. I had been drifting in and out of a light sleep, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me since I woke up. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like the sound of old wood bending under pressure. My eyes snapped open, and my heart leapt into my throat as I saw the door slowly swinging open. For a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming, but the cool air brushing against my skin told me otherwise. A man stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He was tall and thin, wearing a disheveled hospital gown that hung loosely on his frame. But what caught my attention, what made my blood run cold, were his hands. They were stained with blood, fresh and vivid, the dark red stark against his pale skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe he was a patient, someone who had wandered into the wrong room. Maybe it wasn't blood, just some sort of trick of the light. But as he stepped further into the room, his face became visible, and all thoughts of rationality fled. His skin was pallid, almost sickly, and his eyes were hollow, as if they had seen things that couldn't be unseen. There was a strange, almost ghostly aura about him, something that made the air around him feel colder. I opened my mouth to speak, but my voice came out as a shaky whisper. "Who are you?" For a long moment, he didn't respond, just stood there staring at me with those empty eyes. Then, in a voice that sounded distant, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel, he said, "The nurses sent me." I blinked, my mind scrambling to make sense of his words. The nurses sent him? That didn't make any sense. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stood there, the blood on his hands glistening in the dim light. Panic surged through me, and I reached for the call button, pressing it frantically. The small light on the button blinked, indicating it had been activated, but there was no sound, no response. "Please," I said, my voice trembling now. "You need to leave." For a moment he didn't move, and I was terrified that he might come closer, that he might try to do something. But then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the door slowly closing behind him with a soft click. I was left staring at the door, my heart racing, my mind reeling. Had that really just happened? I wasn't sure if it was the lingering effects of the anesthesia or something else, something I couldn't quite explain. The room felt even colder now, the shadows darker, and the silence heavier. I lay back against the pillow, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting to see if he would return. But the hallway remained quiet, and slowly my breathing began to steady. I wanted to believe that it was just a strange dream, a side effect of the medication, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That man had been real, and the blood on his hands, whatever it was, had been real too. The room felt colder now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind, replaying it over and over again like a broken record. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging out longer than the last. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, when the world felt its most unsettling. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, thicker, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Every little noise from the hallway made me jump. A distant door creaking open, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the muffled sound of footsteps. I couldn't tell if the noises were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My heart wouldn't stop racing, the fear tightening its grip around my chest. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that the man at the door was just a figment of my post-surgery haze. But the details were too vivid to dismiss. The pale face, the blood-stained hands, the hollow eyes. No, that had been real. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt a growing sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. The silence in the room was oppressive, pressing down on me until I couldn't take it anymore. I reached over to the bedside table and fumbled for the remote, my hands shaking as I turned on the TV. The soft glow of the screen filled the room, and I turned the volume down low, just enough to hear the murmur of voices from whatever late-night show was playing. It wasn't much, but it was something to keep the silence at bay. I left the lights on too, hoping that the brightness would chase away the shadows that seemed to be closing in on me. But even with the TV and the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if there was an unsettling presence in the room, something I couldn't see but could feel deep in my gut. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my eyes darting around the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I knew I wouldn't sleep tonight. How could I? With that encounter replaying in my mind and the sense of dread gnawing at my insides. I just had to make it until morning, until the sun came up and the world felt normal again. But right now, the night felt endless, and I was trapped in it, wide awake and waiting for something I couldn't name. Morning brought a sense of relief as sunlight streamed into the room, washing away the shadows that had haunted me through the night. The room felt different now, less foreboding, but the memory of the man lingered. When the morning nurse came in to check my vitals, I hesitated but eventually asked, "Did anyone come into my room last night? A man in a hospital gown?" She looked puzzled. "No, dear. No one like that was on this floor." Her confusion only deepened my frustration and fear. Was I hallucinating? The nurse was kind but dismissive, her expression shifting to concern as she noticed my growing distress. I couldn't shake the unease, so I called my boyfriend, needing to hear his voice. When I told him what happened, he was calm, reassuring me that he'd come as soon as he could. But even with his promise, the anxiety stayed, a shadow in the back of my mind that the morning light couldn't quite banish. Night fell once more, and with it, the hospital returned to its eerie quiet. The hallway lights flickered occasionally, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I tried to stay calm, but as I lay there, the fear from the night before crept back in. Then, he appeared again, closer this time. The same man, his hands still bloody, his voice a low, almost whispering plea for help. Terror gripped me as I realized this wasn't a dream. I tried to scream, but my voice barely broke the silence, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. His face was even more gaunt, ghostly, his eyes vacant yet pleading. Blood dripped onto the floor, unnoticed by him. Panicking, I attempted to get out of bed, but pain shot through me, and the IV line tugged me back. I reached for anything within my grasp to defend myself, but before I could act, he vanished, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. The room now felt like a prison, every shadow hiding a potential threat. The ticking clock seemed to grow louder, more ominous with each passing second. I couldn't take it anymore. I demanded to be moved, but the nurses shook their heads, insisting the hospital was at full capacity. Frustration and fear boiled over into anger. Was I losing my mind? The nurses exchanged worried glances, and one mentioned speaking to a psychiatrist. The suggestion sent a spike of anxiety through me. Desperate, I begged my boyfriend to stay with me through the night. He promised to be there as soon as visiting hours began, but until then, I felt utterly trapped and helpless, with no escape from the growing terror. The hospital felt more haunted than ever that night, the silence so thick it seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. Every creak and groan of the building felt like an omen, a warning of something terrible yet to come. I lay there, wide awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. And then he returned. He stood at the foot of my bed, his figure faintly illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. This time, there was something different about him. His presence felt less menacing, more sorrowful. I could see the deep sadness etched into his gaunt, ghostly face, and the fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen its hold, replaced by a morbid curiosity. He spoke clearly this time, his voice calm but tinged with sorrow. "I was a patient here," he began, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "I died in this very hospital, neglected by the staff." I listened, my heart pounding, as he recounted his story. He had been admitted for something routine, something that should have been easily treated, but mistakes were made, his condition was ignored, and the blood on his hands, the blood that now dripped onto the floor, was a result of the injuries that were left untreated until it was too late. There was a strange, tragic resignation in his voice as he spoke, and I found myself forgetting my terror, caught up in the sadness of his tale. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just a ghost haunting these halls. He was a soul trapped in his own nightmare, reliving his final moments over and over again, a victim of the very place that was supposed to save him. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. He looked at me with those hollow eyes, the sadness in them almost unbearable to witness, but before he could answer, his form began to waver like smoke in the wind. I reached out, desperate for some kind of resolution, some explanation for why he had chosen to visit me, but it was too late. He faded away, dissolving into the darkness of the room, leaving me alone once more. I was left with more questions than answers, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just experienced. The fear that had momentarily lifted returned, but now it was mixed with something else. A deep sense of unease, of empathy for this lost soul, and a nagging suspicion that there was more to this than I understood. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the spot where he had stood, the room feeling colder and more oppressive than ever. Sleep was impossible, my thoughts too tangled and troubled to allow any rest. I knew I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? Who would understand that the man I had seen was not just a figment of my imagination, but a lingering spirit, a reminder of the hospital's failure? The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity, as I tried to piece together the fragments of what had happened. There was no escaping the sense that I had been drawn into something far beyond my comprehension, something that wouldn't let me go until I understood its purpose. The first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, casting a pale light across the room, but they did little to dispel the lingering shadows in my mind. I was left with a haunting realization that this was not over, and that the answers I sought might come at a greater cost than I was prepared to pay. The next morning, the hospital looked different in the daylight, but the sense of foreboding still clung to me. When my boyfriend arrived, I wasted no time telling him everything. Together, we started digging into the hospital's history, searching for any clue about the ghostly visitor. It didn't take long to find old news articles about a scandal involving patient neglect that had led to several deaths. One of those deaths matched the ghost's description perfectly. The same injuries, the same tragic end. The more we read, the more the details haunted me. It was exactly as the ghost had described. The hospital had tried to cover it up, but the truth had a way of surfacing. Determined to find closure, we decided to confront the hospital staff with what we'd uncovered, hoping they could offer some explanation, or at least acknowledge the truth behind the haunting. That night, the hospital room felt different, heavy with anticipation. The lights flickered more frequently and the air seemed charged with an eerie energy. I knew he would come. When he appeared, he was more solid and real than ever before. His presence no longer filled me with terror, but with a deep sense of empathy. He looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and asked for my help in finding peace. I felt a surge of emotion, wanting to help him but unsure how. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Remember me," he said softly, "and share my story." I nodded, feeling the weight of his request. His form, now less ghostly and more human, held a profound sadness. The blood on his hands had dried like a stain that couldn't be washed away. "I promise," I told him, "I'll remember you and share your story." With that, he gave me a small, grateful smile, and finally faded away, leaving behind a strange sense of calm that replaced the fear. The room, once oppressive, now felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The hospital room felt different as I prepared for discharge, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The morning sun brought warmth and peace. My boyfriend and I left, both forever changed by the experience. The drive home was quiet, and the world outside seemed more vivid. I felt a deep sense of closure, believing the ghostly visitor had finally found peace. Back home, I sat down and began writing his story. As I typed out the final words, a strange sense of fulfillment washed over me. His story, once haunting, would now be remembered, ensuring he was not forgotten.